Good evening. Thank you so much for joining me as I give my final presentation for EDU 504 entitled An Action Plan for Student and Teacher Resilience. I would like to give two disclaimers. One, I am a special educator in an elementary school setting, so a number of my perspectives come from that setting that I am in. As a second disclaimer, my large dog decides the most inconvenient time to get the zoomies, so I hope you can excuse any extraneous noise in the background. With that being said, let's begin. The evolution of education has changed drastically over the last 100 years. And in the last 30 years, understanding of trauma informed education and practices has also changed drastically. As the research around the prevalence of trauma in our classrooms has increased, the need for a plan to address this crisis in our schools has become imperative. But we cannot forget that unsupported teachers cannot adequately support traumatized students. So, with that, my goal is to answer our course question. That being, in light of what is known about how children learn, how shall professional educators best promote resilience and recovery for the children and their families who have experienced traumatic events? As we begin, let's talk about what childhood trauma is. As an initial definition, it's important to know trauma is not the event, but instead the response to the event, be that physiological or psychological. These events can take two forms. Those are quite commonly categorized as single event trauma or ongoing trauma. Examples of single event trauma can be a car crash, death of a loved one, or surviving a natural disaster, while ongoing trauma may include homelessness, having a parent with substance abuse disorder, and maltreatment. It's important to note the comorbidity factor, as many forms of trauma can create additional traumatic circumstances. A great way to illustrate this is the death of a parent. The death of a parent can lead to financial insecurity due to the loss of income. That can lead to food and housing insecurity, perhaps even homelessness, and even in terrible situations, child maltreatment if the surviving parent struggles to cope with the loss. It's also important to know the effects of prenatal stress on childhood development. We know that prenatal stress and prenatal trauma can cause changes to the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which is the processes in our body responsible for the cortisol and adrenaline production, also known as our stress hormones. This will be important as we move forward. Finally, let's talk about toxic stress. While toxic stress may not be an individual trauma, it is long term and under supported stress. This stress might be considered normal in short bursts, but as it continues over time, can cause the same effects as a traumatic event might. So, how does this trauma impact the ability to learn in an academic setting? First, we can talk about the hyperactive fight, flight, freeze, befriend response. This is where that overactive HPA axis and the overproduction of cortisol and adrenaline comes in. Children who have this neurobiological change and overproduction of cortisol and adrenaline can often go into this fight, flight, freeze, befriend response at very small stimuli. Next is difficulty concentrating. Difficulty concentrating can come from a number of factors related to trauma. This can be hunger, low literacy due to frequent moves, not being able to attend to that instruction because they can't keep up. This can include exhaustion, And psychologically, worrying about their home life and their families. This is not an exhaustive list. Particularly in chronic trauma, such as community violence and immigration, families and in turn students can have a distrust of teachers, seeing them as either complicit in the trauma or even as unsafe instigators. An example of this could be a child who is homeless may fear that a teacher report will lead to them being separated from their family. In addition, students may experience somatic symptoms such as head and stomach aches. While this is often seen in young children who may not yet have the ability to verbalize or process what is or has happened, it can also happen with older adolescents. Frequent trips to the health room may potentially be a sign of something bigger. It's also important to remember that the impact on academic learning could be exhaustive and is individual to each student. Two students who have lived through the same traumatic event can be affected by trauma, but have completely different symptoms and struggles. Okay, so what's the plan? It can be very overwhelming to have information on student trauma and its effects and not having tools to help. As we continue, we will address a strategic plan to help foster resiliency and recovery in the classroom. Step one is a global social emotional learning instruction. In this situation, global refers to across all school environments, from the general education classroom to related arts to the lunchroom and playground and everything in between. So, social emotional learning, also known as SEL, is a tier one intervention that typically focuses on the five key areas of executive functioning, those being self awareness, self management, social awareness, relationship skills, and decision making. This explicit instruction on the variety of topics can include the teaching of self regulation strategies, identifying feelings, how to resolve peer conflict, and learning reflection strategies. Cell time can often include class check ins or meetings where students may share how they are feeling, what they hope to learn, or what has happened to them over the weekend. This can help create a classroom community where students care for each other and, in turn, care for themselves. This cell learning doesn't have to stop at our explicit cell time. It can also be included in hidden curriculum. An example of cell in hidden curriculum could be a teacher displaying how to use a self regulation strategy when they are frustrated. Students, please give me a moment. I'm feeling frustrated. I need to take 5 deep breaths. Hidden curriculum can also be included with facilitating peer conflicts during academic tasks. So now step two, having a predictable environment with high expectations. Safety and predictability is paramount. Environment should be clean and well maintained as well as organized. The teacher in this room should be psychologically safe and open to hearing what students have to say. For classroom routines, such as where to put their belongings, classroom transitions, and assignments, these should be consistent and regularly reviewed. This should also apply to classroom rules and procedure. In elementary schools, a truly wonderful trend has occurred where classrooms are making rules and expectations together. This often looks like in the first week of school or the first week of a class, sitting together in a community meeting, talking about expectations, expectation for student behavior, for teacher behavior, for classroom environment. And this really does help, once again, impact that classroom community. Moving into work expectations, they should remain high for all students, while keeping in mind how a student may display their knowledge and the time in which they have to complete that work. Coming from a special education background, something we often talk about is the difference between modifications and accommodations. Not all students need modifications, which is changing the standard that a student is working toward, such as doing multiple choice instead of an essay question. But many students need accommodations, such as additional time, graphic organizers, and the ability to display their learning in a different way, such as the opportunity to present this to you in a visual auditory presentation as opposed to an essay. Strategy 3, or step 3, is to apply strategies specific to the situation. Individual situations call for individualized supports. Every child who has lived through a traumatic experience and is dealing with the impact of trauma has individual needs. And it's important to be in collaborative partnerships with other professionals in your building to best support these students. Professionals may be your school counselor, school psychologist, or social worker. Some schools are fortunate enough to have Title I staff who are able to connect with parents. That way, we can select strategies and tools specific to that child's situation. There are different traumas to be aware of. Well, once again, this is not an exhaustive list. These traumas can include sexual abuse, homelessness, maltreatment, loss of a loved one, military deployment, as well as others. And each of these situations have research-based strategies to support students. Teachers would be well to learn these strategies so that students can feel supported. A friend once said to me, "You cannot pour from an empty cup." The same goes for all educators and school based professionals. Secondary traumatic stress is common among those who support youth that have experienced trauma. This secondary traumatic stress, also known as STS, can mimic the symptoms of PTSD as defined by the DSM 5. Because of this, it's important for educators, administrators, and school systems to focus on teacher wellness. This includes using strategies at a school-wide level as well as an individual level. School-wide can have a focus on mindfulness, the ability to leave work at work, and professional development days where teachers can complete work or other tasks in order to feel like a more well-rounded human. Some additional things that individual educators can do to support their own mental health, their own well-being, is once a day, leave the school, take a walk outside, breathe in the fresh air, remember that there is a world outside of your classroom, and spend time with your loved ones without talking about work. It's important for educators to remember that they are more than their jobs, and it is okay to walk away from the classroom or even the profession if you feel like you can no longer be effective. So, in conclusion, how can we support resilience and recovery for students and families who have experienced trauma? First, before a plan can even be developed, it is important for educators and school based professionals to understand trauma and the effects it has on learning, including the effects of prenatal stress and trauma's effect on neurobiological development. With that learning, a 3-step plan can be developed. On a most general level, cell instruction for all students in both explicit and hidden curriculums can help by providing strategies for progressing through the world around them, as well as building executive functioning skills. In this same global level, ensuring that each classroom has not only a thoughtfully designed physical space, but as well as the creation of consistent routines and high expectation for all students can promote that resilience. And a final third step for this plan is learning about the individual students and applying specific research based strategies based on individual needs. In order to enact this plan and others like it, teachers must be in a supportive environment where steps are taken to promote teacher wellness, both on the individual and systematic level. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation today. I hope that this has been an opportunity for some reflection and that you have a wonderful evening.